Head around government budgets, all these trillions flying around, deficits, and you're just stuck on that basic question. Where does the government actually get the money to spend?
It's a really common question, and honestly, the standard answers, they often feel a bit incomplete, maybe even misleading.
Well, get ready for maybe a bit of a mind bender today. We're doing a deep dive into this fascinating 1998 paper by Stephanie Bell. It's called Can Taxes and Bonds Finance Government Spending?
And it's not just some dry academic thing. Bell's work really pushes back against a core belief many of us hold about economics and government.
Exactly, because she makes this, well, pretty startling argument. She basically says the common idea that governments have to tax or borrow first before they can spend is just fundamentally wrong.
That's the crux of it. She looks at the actual operational nuts and bolts, how the Treasury and the Federal Reserve really interact, and it paints a very different picture.
So, our mission today, for you listening, is to unpack this paper. We want to give you a clear, hopefully concise, and maybe surprising look at how government spending really works, operationally speaking. We think it offers a fresh perspective, might clear up some confusion. Okay, let's get into it.
Right, let's tackle that core argument head on, because, like you said, it cuts against the grain. Bell argues government spending doesn't require prior taxes or bond sales. Operationally, the spending happens first.
That just feels so backward. How can you spend money you haven't collected? Like, I can't spend my paycheck before I get it, right?
Uh-huh. But the government isn't like a household or a business in that sense, especially a government that issues its own currency, like the U.S. When the Treasury makes a payment, say, to a defense contractor or for Social Security, it doesn't usually dip into a pot of tax money. Instead, the Fed, the government's bank, it just debits the Treasury's account there and credits the reserve account of the contractor's commercial bank.
So wait, the money isn't being, like, transferred from tax receipts? It's more like the government instructs the Fed to create it electronically right then and there.
In effect, yes. These are brand new reserves entering the banking system. Think of reserves as the electronic cash banks hold at the Fed. Now, contrast that with taxes. When you pay your taxes, that money flows into the Treasury's account at the Fed. And what happens then? Those reserves are effectively removed from the banking system. Deleted, you could say. They aren't stockpiled for later spending. They're just gone from circulation.
Whoa, okay. So taxes aren't funding spending in that direct way, I imagine. Their main job is more like managing the total amount of money out there, taking some out.
That's a really key part of Bell's analysis, yes. And something similar happens with bond sales, although there's a little nuance there. Generally, when the Treasury sells bonds, that also drains reserves from banks as people buy them.
Okay.
But Bell notes it's not quite that simple, especially when you factor in something called Treasury tax and loan accounts.
Treasury tax and loan accounts.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds technical. What do they do?
Basically, they're accounts the Treasury holds at commercial banks. Sometimes tax receipts or bond proceeds go there first, before moving to the Fed. But Bell's point is the main reason for this coordination, for using these T&L accounts and working closely with the Fed day to day. It isn't really about making sure the Treasury has funds to spend. It's mostly about managing what she calls reserve effects.
Reserve effects.
Yeah, the impact that government spending, adding reserves, and taxing, draining reserves, has on the total level of reserves in the banking system. This affects short-term interest rates, specifically the federal funds rate the rate banks charge each other for overnight loans. The goal is to keep that rate stable near the Fed's target. It's about financial stability, less about funding specific programs.
Wow. So managing the financial system's plumbing is the priority, not just topping up the government's checking account. That definitely shifts the perspective.
It really does. And that brings us neatly to rethinking government bonds. We usually hear that when the government runs a deficit, it has to sell bonds to borrow money and cover the gap.
Right. That's the standard story.
Yep.
Government borrowing, national debt.
Bell argues that's not quite the right way to look at it, operationally. Yes, bond sales happen when there are deficits, and yes, it increases the figure we call the national debt. But she suggests their main function isn't funding the spending itself. It's better understood as a monetary policy operation.
A monetary operation, what does that mean exactly?
Well, two main things in our current system. First, bonds offer a safe, interest-paying place for people, companies, even other countries to put their savings. Government debt is considered very low risk.
Okay, a savings vehicle. Makes sense.
Second, and maybe more crucially, it helps the Fed manage interest rates. Selling bonds pulls reserves out of the banking system. If the Fed wants to nudge interest rates up, Having the Treasury issue bonds can help absorb some of the reserves created by government spending, making it easier for the Fed to maintain its target rate.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. So the government doesn't need the bond money to be able to spend. Selling bonds is more about managing the consequences of that spending on bank reserves and interest rates and providing that safe asset.
That's a good way to put it. Think about the balance sheets. When the government spends, it creates reserves that's a liability of the Fed, held by commercial banks. When the Treasury sells a bond, it's basically swapping that reserve liability for a Treasury security liability, held by whoever bought the bond. From the private sector's perspective, they just swapped one type of government liability, bank reserves, for another, a T-bond.
So a government deficit paired with bond sales doesn't mean the government is broke like a household. It actually means the private sector has more net financial assets, either reserves or bonds.
That's a really significant implication of this view, yes. The government's deficit spending corresponds to an increase in the net financial wealth held by the non-government sector.
This really reframes things. But okay, if taxes aren't needed to spend, why have them at all? Why not just spend?
That's the essential follow-up question. Bell doesn't say taxes are unimportant. Far from it. They just don't function as the operational prerequisite for spending. Taxes serve other critical functions. They help regulate demand, pull spending power out of the economy to prevent overheating or inflation. They could be used to redistribute wealth or discourage certain activities. And, very fundamentally, taxes create an ongoing demand for the government's currency.
How so?
Well, if you know you have to pay your taxes in, say, US dollars, you need to get hold of dollars, that makes you willing to accept dollars in payment for goods or services. It underpins the currency's acceptance.
Okay, that makes sense. So taxes are vital, just maybe not for the reason most of us assume.
Exactly. And Bell highlights this with a neat logical point, kind of a chicken and egg thing. If the government truly needed to collect tax dollars before it could spend any dollars,
Hmm.
where would people get those first dollars to pay their taxes?
Oh, right. Yeah, the government would have had to spend them out there first, somehow.
Precisely. It's like, imagine Apple saying you have to pay using an Apple gift card, but Apple hasn't issued any gift cards yet. It doesn't work. Apple has to spend the gift cards into existence first. Similarly, the government has to spend its currency into the economy before it can logically demand it back in taxes. Spending is the initial act,
That's a really powerful, simple illustration.
and it's backed up by the accounting at the Fed. When tax money, or money from bond sales, hits the Treasury's main account at the Fed, it doesn't sit there like in a savings account. Those reserves are effectively extinguished, destroyed. They vanish from the banking system's balance sheet.
Destroyed. Wow. So they can't be spent.
Correct. Which reinforces the idea that government spending isn't constrained by those inflows. It's initiated separately. And Bell's analysis, by the way, still holds up even though the Fed now pays interest on reserves, which wasn't the case in 1998. That changes some bank incentives, sure, but not the basic operational flow of spending, taxing, and bond sales.
Okay, this is incredibly clarifying, but also kind of turns things upside down. So what are the practical consequences? Why does seeing government finance this way actually matter?
It matters hugely for how we approach policy debates. It shifts the focus. Instead of the conversation always getting stuck on how will you pay for it, assuming taxes or bonds are the only starting point,
Yeah.
we can ask more economically relevant questions.
Like what are the real constraints then, if not the money itself?
Like,
Yeah.
is our economy already running at full tilt? Do we have unemployed people who could be put to work? Are there enough real resources, steel, concrete, engineers, programmers, healthcare workers available to actually do the thing the government wants to spend on? What's the risk of this new spending pushing up prices, causing inflation because we're trying to buy more than the economy can actually produce right now?
So the limits are about real stuff, labor, materials, capacity, not just digits in the Treasury's account.
Exactly. The constraints are real, not purely financial for a currency-issuing government. This view supports what some call mission-based planning. You identify a goal-fixing infrastructure, transitioning to clean energy, improving public health, and then you analyze if the real economic capacity exists to achieve it with government spending. We've seen this kind of thinking in action, even if not named this way. Think about the massive mobilization during World War II, or the New Deal, or even the large-scale relief during the COVID pandemic. The government spent significantly then because the mission demanded it, and resources, particularly unemployed labor, were available.
Right. So Bell's work explains how that kind of spending is operationally possible. It doesn't automatically mean any specific spending is good policy, though.
Precisely. Her analysis is descriptive, not prescriptive. It describes the mechanics of the monetary system. It gives policymakers and us a clearer picture of the operational possibilities and constraints, the political decisions about what to spend on, how much, and what goals to pursue. Those are separate, vital debates.
Okay, so wrapping this up then, Stephanie Bell's 1998 paper offers this really potent evidence-based challenge to the way many of us typically think about government finance.
Yes, it fundamentally questions that tax or borrow first, then the spend sequence. By looking at the operational reality, particularly reserve accounting at the Fed, she shows spending can, and often does, come first. Taxes and bonds play crucial roles, absolutely, but perhaps different roles than just funding the spending initially. They manage reserves, influence interest rates, create demand for the currency, and affect wealth distribution.
So for you listening, the big takeaway really is to perhaps step back and reconsider those assumptions about where government money comes from. It seems it's a much more dynamic process and maybe less like our personal household budgets than we tend to think.
Definitely. It's a framework that opens up different questions about economic policy.
It certainly does. Which leads to a final thought to maybe chew on. If this operational understanding is accurate, what new possibilities or maybe what new challenges or dangers arise when we think about the government's role in the economy? Definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive today.